Between the mists of time and the silences imposed by official history, a figure emerges that challenges the consolidated narratives of early Christianity. Mary Magdalene, whose name echoes through the centuries, carrying both reverence and controversy, is revealed in the ancient Ethiopian scriptures as something far beyond what Western interpretations dared to acknowledge. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where Christian traditions took root with a depth that predates many of Europe's centers of faith, textual treasures were preserved that cast a completely different light on the true nature and role of this extraordinary woman. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, guardian of one of the world's oldest Christian heritages, has maintained for over 16 centuries a set of scriptures that remained largely isolated from the reformulations and reinterpretations that shaped Christianity in the West. In these ancestral pages, written in gears and preserved with the care dedicated to the most sacred mysteries, Mary Magdalene emerges not as the repentant and secondary figure that the medieval West constructed, but as a powerful spiritual leader, a first-order evangelist, and a repository of divine revelations that rivaled in importance those granted to the apostles themselves. It is impossible to grasp the magnitude of this difference without recognizing that something fundamental was lost, or deliberately suppressed, in the Christian traditions that dominated the global religious landscape. While European Christianity, especially from the Middle Ages onward, strove to contain Mary Magdalene within the narrow limits of a narrative of personal redemption, transforming her into a repentant prostitute who found salvation through penitence, the Ethiopian traditions preserved a radically different view. Here she is not a redeemed sinner, but a saint of transcendental spiritual power, a missionary who crossed continents to plant the seeds of Christian faith in African soil. This divergence is not merely academic or theological. It reveals the profound tensions that permeated the formation of institutional Christianity and the manner in which certain voices, particularly the feminine voices of spiritual authority, were systematically marginalized or reinterpreted to suit the emerging patriarchal structures. What the Ethiopian scriptures preserved is not just an alternative version of Mary Magdalene's history, but a living testament to how the divine feminine occupied a central place in the first Christian communities, a place that was progressively diminished as the Church became institutionalized and aligned itself with the temporal powers of the Roman Empire. The richness of the Ethiopian traditions concerning Mary Magdalene cannot be understood in isolation from their spiritual geography. Ethiopia, mentioned in the biblical scriptures themselves as a land of wisdom and power, developed a Christianity that maintained unique characteristics, preserving elements of both the early Christian tradition and an ancient African spirituality. This synthesis created an environment where narratives about figures like Mary Magdalene could flourish without the restrictions that characterized the development of Christian theology in Roman Europe. When we examine the Ethiopian texts, we discover not only a different Mary Magdalene, but a completely distinct understanding of what it means to be a disciple, what constitutes spiritual authority, and how the sacred manifests through both the masculine and the feminine. This perspective challenges not only the traditional interpretations of a specific historical figure, but questions the very foundations upon which institutional Christianity built its hierarchies and its exclusions. To properly understand the singular place Mary Magdalene holds in Ethiopian traditions, it is essential to delve into the historical depths of this African Christianity that developed in relative isolation from European influences during crucial centuries of doctrinal formation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, whose roots intertwine with the beginnings of the Christian era, preserved a canon of scriptures that includes texts considered apocryphal by Western traditions, thus creating a unique repository of early Christian narratives that escaped the revisions and censures imposed by later councils. This preservation was not accidental, but the result of a geography, both physical and spiritual, that allowed certain currents of early Christianity to flourish far from the centers of imperial power. While Mediterranean Christianity was constantly forced to negotiate with the political and social structures of the Greco-Roman world, adapting its messages and structures to accommodate the expectations of a patriarchal and hierarchical society, Ethiopian Christianity developed in a different cultural context, where indigenous spiritual traditions offered space for concepts of religious authority that naturally included feminine power and wisdom. The Ethiopian Synaxarium, that monumental compilation of hagiographies and liturgical celebrations that serves as the living memory of the Ethiopian Church, presents Mary Magdalene in a way that would be almost unrecognizable to a Christian educated exclusively in Western traditions. Here she is not simply a passive witness to the resurrection, but an active figure in the propagation of the faith, an evangelist who undertook missionary journeys that led her to the Ethiopian lands, where she established lasting Christian communities and transmitted teachings that became an integral part of the local spiritual tradition. This narrative of Mary Magdalene as a missionary to Ethiopia should not be viewed as a simple local legend, but as part of a broader understanding of how Christianity spread beyond the borders of the Mediterranean world. The Ethiopian tradition of a direct apostolic connection, exemplified not only by the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch recounted in the Acts of the Apostles, but also by the missions attributed to figures like Mary Magdalene, reflects a self-perception of this church as a legitimate and direct heir to the original apostolic teachings, unfiltered by the later interpretations that molded European Christianity. Particularly significant is the way Ethiopian texts incorporated and interpreted Gnostic writings such as the Gospel of Mary, granting them a legitimacy they never obtained in Western traditions. In these Ethiopian interpretations, the conflicts between Mary Magdalene and Peter, so clearly articulated in the Gnostic text, are not seen as abstract theological disputes, but as reflections of very real tensions over spiritual authority, divine revelation, and the role of women in religious leadership. The preservation and veneration of these texts in Ethiopia suggest a tradition that remained more open to concepts of distributed and less rigidly hierarchical spiritual authority. The integration of these Gnostic elements into Ethiopian traditions reveals something fundamental about the nature of this African Christianity. Its capacity to embrace and synthesize different currents of early Christian spirituality without the need to exclude or suppress those that did not conform to the emerging orthodoxies. This characteristic allowed concepts about the divine feminine, direct mystical revelation, and unconventional forms of spiritual authority to find fertile ground in the Ethiopian highlands, creating an environment where a figure like Mary Magdalene could be celebrated in all her complexity and power. In the pages of the Ethiopian manuscripts, Mary Magdalene emerges as a figure of truly apostolic proportions, stripped of the interpretive limitations that confined her, in Western traditions, to the role of a grateful penitent. The Acts of Mary, preserved in Ethiopian hagiographical literature, not only narrate her presence with Jesus during his earthly ministry, but extensively detail her later missionary activities, presenting her as an evangelist who crossed continents to bring the Christian message to peoples who had never heard of the Nazarene. This narrative positions Mary Magdalene not as a peripheral figure in the drama of salvation, but as a central protagonist whose missionary work was fundamental to the establishment of Christianity in territories that extended far beyond the borders of the Mediterranean world. The Ethiopian tradition presents a Mary Magdalene, who after the ascension of Jesus undertook an epic journey that led her across the Red Sea to the highlands of Ethiopia, where she not only preached the gospel, but established a network of Christian communities that became the foundations upon which the Ethiopian church was erected. This narrative is presented not as a pious legend, but as sacred history, integrated into the liturgical traditions and celebrated annually in the festivities that honor the saints and martyrs who brought the Christian faith to East Africa. The accuracy and consistency with which these traditions have been preserved over the centuries suggest that they represent deeply rooted communal memories, transmitted through generations of believers who saw in Mary Magdalene not just a distant saint, but a founding figure of their own spiritual heritage. What makes these Ethiopian narratives particularly significant is the way they articulate Mary Magdalene's role, not only as an evangelist, but as a recipient of special revelations and as an interpretive authority of Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of Mary, preserved and venerated in Ethiopian traditions, presents her as a visionary who received direct instructions from the risen Christ, instructions that were not shared with the other disciples, and that positioned her as a unique intermediary between the divine and the human. This characterization fundamentally challenges the apostolic hierarchies established by Western traditions, suggesting that spiritual authority was not the exclusive property of the male circle of the 12, but could be conferred upon those who demonstrated the spiritual capacity necessary to receive and transmit divine revelations. The Ethiopian representation of Mary Magdalene as a teacher and revealer introduces a deeply subversive dimension into the traditional Christian narrative. In the text preserved by the Ethiopian Church, she is not just a disciple who learned from Jesus, but an initiate who received special esoteric knowledge that qualified her to teach even the most established apostles. This dynamic is particularly evident in the descriptions of her confrontations with Peter, where she is portrayed not as a subordinate challenging established authority, but as a spiritual equal defending authentic revelations against attempts at suppression or minimization. These narratives suggest very real tensions in early Christianity over issues of gender, authority, and direct access to the sacred. The Ethiopian tradition also preserved fascinating details about Mary Magdalene's missionary methods and the nature of her spiritual influence. Unlike Western narratives that tend to emphasize emotional or devotional aspects of her religiosity, the Ethiopian texts present her as a sophisticated theologian, capable of articulating complex doctrines and adapting the Christian message to the cultural sensitivities of different peoples. Her mission in Ethiopia is described not as simple preaching but as an intellectual and spiritual undertaking that involved the translation of Christian concepts into African contexts, creating theological syntheses that honored both the original message and local spiritual traditions. The Ethiopian iconography of Mary Magdalene reveals, perhaps more clearly than any text, the profound divergence between the African and Western conceptions of this central figure of early Christianity. While traditional European Christian art typically depicts Mary Magdalene in poses of penitence, often semi-naked or dressed in simple tunics that emphasize her humility and repentance, Ethiopian representations present her wrapped in regal vestments, adorned with the insignia of spiritual authority, and positioned in contexts that clearly identify her as a religious leader of the first magnitude. This difference is not merely aesthetic, but reflects fundamentally different understandings of the nature of her sanctity and the type of spiritual example she represents for the faithful. In the illuminated manuscripts and mural paintings of the ancient Ethiopian churches, Mary Magdalene frequently appears carrying a golden cross or a sacred scroll, symbols that unequivocally identify her as an evangelist and teacher of the faith. Her robes, far from suggesting penitence or forced humility, display the colors and patterns associated with spiritual royalty in the Ethiopian tradition, positioning her on the same iconographic level occupied by the great saints and the apostles themselves. This visual representation articulates a theology that sees in Mary Magdalene not a redeemed sinner, but a divine chosen one, a figure whose spiritual authority derived not from her personal transformation, but from her inherent capacity to receive and transmit sacred revelations. Particularly notable is the frequency with which Ethiopian iconography represents Mary Magdalene in contexts of teaching and leadership, surrounded by disciples who clearly recognize her as a spiritual authority. These representations contrast dramatically with Western artistic traditions, which rarely, if ever, present Mary Magdalene in positions of authority over other believers. In Ethiopian art, she is not merely a devoted follower, but a teacher who transmits sacred knowledge, a leader who organizes communities, and an authority who resolves theological disputes. This iconography suggests a tradition that preserved memories of an early Christianity where feminine spiritual leadership was not only accepted, but celebrated as a legitimate manifestation of divine grace. The integration of Mary Magdalene into Ethiopian folklore traditions adds yet another dimension to her representation, connecting her historical figure with universal archetypes of feminine wisdom and spiritual power. In the popular narratives preserved by the Ethiopian oral tradition, Mary Magdalene often appears as an almost mythical figure, whose spiritual or even biological descendants exerted continued influence over the religious and political life of the region. Some local traditions even assert that lineages of spiritual guardians responsible for the protection of sacred sites and the preservation of esoteric knowledge trace directly back to the teachings and example left by Mary Magdalene during her Ethiopian mission. This process of mythologization should not be viewed as a distortion of history, but as evidence of the profound impression Mary Magdalene's figure made on the Ethiopian spiritual consciousness. The transformation of a historical figure into a cultural archetype reflects the way her qualities and achievements resonated with values and aspirations deeply rooted in African spirituality, particularly regarding the recognition of feminine forms of sacred authority and the valuing of mystical traditions that prioritize the direct experience of the divine over institutional mediations. The preservation of these folkloric and iconographic traditions in Ethiopian communities represents a form of cultural and spiritual resistance to the limiting interpretations that dominated institutional Christianity. By keeping alive the memory of a powerful, wise, and influential Mary Magdalene, Ethiopian traditions offered a counter-narrative to the tendencies that sought to minimize or domesticate feminine expressions of spiritual authority. This resistance was not necessarily conscious or deliberate, but naturally emerged from a cultural context that remained more receptive to concepts of religious leadership that transcended the gender limitations imposed by other Christian traditions. The theological implications of the Ethiopian traditions concerning Mary Magdalene extend far beyond historiographical or devotional questions, touching upon fundamental issues about the nature of revelation, the distribution of spiritual authority, and the role of the divine feminine in the economy of salvation. When examined in the context of the doctrinal struggles that marked the first centuries of Christianity, these traditions suggest the existence of alternative theological currents that were progressively marginalized or suppressed as certain interpretations became orthodox through processes that involved both theological argumentation and the exercise of political and institutional power. The syncretism that characterizes the Ethiopian traditions about Mary Magdalene should not be understood as a simple, superficial adaptation of Christian elements to African contexts, but as a sophisticated theological synthesis that integrated early Christian concepts with indigenous spiritual traditions in a way that created a coherent and distinctive vision of sacred reality. This synthesis allowed elements of Gnostic and mystical Christianity, which encountered increasing resistance in Mediterranean traditions, to flourish on African soil, thereby preserving perspectives on issues such as direct revelation, feminine spiritual authority, and the nature of mystical experience that otherwise might have been completely lost. The Ethiopian veneration of Mary Magdalene, as a recipient of special revelations and as an interpretive authority of Jesus' teachings, represents a direct challenge to the hierarchical conceptions of spiritual authority that became dominant in institutional Christianity. In the traditions preserved by the Ethiopian Church, the capacity to receive and interpret divine revelations is not limited to specific institutional structures or officially recognized positions within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but can be conferred upon any individual who demonstrates the necessary spiritual receptivity. This perspective opens space for forms of religious authority that transcend the limitations imposed by considerations of gender, social position, or institutional affiliation. The integration of Gnostic elements into the Ethiopian traditions about Mary Magdalene also reveals a different approach to the issue of theological diversity within early Christianity. While Western traditions tended to establish clear boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy, systematically excluding perspectives that did not conform to officially approved interpretations, the Ethiopian tradition demonstrated greater flexibility and inclusivity, preserving and honoring texts and traditions that offered alternative perspectives on central theological questions. This more open approach allowed concepts about the nature of revelation, the role of women in spiritual leadership, and the relationship between esoteric knowledge and salvation to find legitimate expression within the Christian context. The Ethiopian tradition of connecting Mary Magdalene with the establishment of spiritual lineages and the transmission of esoteric knowledge suggests an understanding of apostolic continuity that differs significantly from the institutional models that became dominant in other Christian traditions. Here, apostolic authority is not the exclusive property of a formal institutional succession, but can be transmitted through direct spiritual bonds and mystical initiations that connect masters and disciples in chains of transmission that transcend temporal and geographical limitations. This perspective offers an alternative to rigidly hierarchical conceptions of ecclesiastical authority, suggesting more fluid and charismatic forms of spiritual leadership. The cultural syncretism that characterizes the Ethiopian traditions about Mary Magdalene also illustrates how early Christianity could adapt and enrich itself through the encounter with non-Christian spiritual traditions, creating syntheses that honored both the specificity of the Christian message and the spiritual wisdom of the receiving cultures. This capacity for cultural synthesis contrasts with later tendencies that sought to impose uniform forms of Christian expression, often at the cost of suppressing local traditions and marginalizing theological perspectives that did not conform to standards established by the centers of ecclesiastical power. The discovery and study of the Ethiopian traditions concerning Mary Magdalene represent more than an exercise in academic curiosity or religious archaeology. They constitute a fundamental invitation to rethink the established narratives about Christian origins and the processes through which certain interpretations became dominant, while others were relegated to oblivion or marginalization. What emerges from the Ethiopian manuscripts is not simply an alternative version of the history of a specific figure, but a living testament to how early Christianity was much more diverse, complex, and inclusive than later traditions allowed to become known. This suppressed diversity was not the result of natural processes of doctrinal development, but reflected deliberate choices made by ecclesiastical and political leaders who sought to consolidate power through the imposition of interpretive uniformity and the marginalization of voices that represented alternative perspectives. The case of Mary Magdalene clearly illustrates how these choices particularly affected feminine expressions of spiritual authority, transforming figures who originally occupied central positions in the early Christian communities into peripheral characters whose significance was systematically diminished or distorted. The preservation of the Ethiopian traditions about Mary Magdalene offers a unique opportunity to recover perspectives that were lost in the processes of doctrinal consolidation that marked the first centuries of Christianity. These traditions not only document the existence of alternative interpretations, but demonstrate how these interpretations could flourish in contexts that remained relatively isolated from the homogenizing pressures that characterized the development of Christianity in the centers of imperial power. The Ethiopian Church, through its geographical location and distinctive cultural characteristics, functioned as a repository of early Christian traditions that otherwise would have been completely extinguished. The study of these traditions also reveals the fundamental importance of cultural geography in the preservation of religious diversity. The development of Ethiopian Christianity in relative isolation from Mediterranean influences allowed certain currents of early Christian thought to continue to develop without the restrictions imposed by the emerging orthodoxies, thereby creating a natural laboratory for understanding how Christianity might have evolved under different cultural and political conditions. This perspective offers valuable insights not only into the Christian past, but into the still unexplored possibilities of theological and spiritual development. The contemporary implications of the Ethiopian traditions concerning Mary Magdalene extend far beyond academic, historical, or theological interest. In an era when questions about religious authority, feminine leadership, and spiritual inclusivity occupy a central place in debates about the future of Christian traditions, these ancient African perspectives offer important historical precedents for arguments about more egalitarian and inclusive forms of religious organization. The discovery that early Christianity was much more receptive to feminine spiritual leadership than later traditions suggested provides historical foundations for contemporary movements seeking to expand opportunities for female participation in religious life. The growing availability of translations and critical studies of Ethiopian texts is gradually making these traditions accessible to broader audiences, creating opportunities for intercultural dialogues on issues of spiritual authority, divine revelation, and theological diversity. This process of rediscovery not only enriches our historical understanding, but offers spiritual and intellectual resources for contemporary communities seeking more inclusive and authentic ways to express their Christian faith. Finally, the story of Mary Magdalene as preserved in Ethiopian traditions serves as a powerful reminder that the voices silenced by official history are not necessarily lost forever. Through patient research and a commitment to the recovery of marginalized traditions, it is possible to rediscover perspectives that offer alternatives to the dominant narratives and that enrich our understanding of both the past and future possibilities. The figure of Mary Magdalene, emerging from the pages of Ethiopian manuscripts in all her complexity and power, offers inspiration for all those who seek to recover the lost voices of history and honor the diversity of the human experience of the sacred.